to the faculty-led workshop of the, the Teaching Fellowship. Today we're going to go ahead, Rebecca is going to give a nice overview of the program. We're going to meet the fabulous panel. We've got 3 here in Pullman and 1 in Vancouver. And then we'll run through some preset questions, and then there'll be a time for the audience to answer, to ask any questions. We do ask if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question that you kind of give a wave of a hand, and we'll give you a microphone so that Gretchen and everybody online can hear you. Also, I forgot, Rebecca, remind me last time. I'm Christy Kittle, I'm from AOI, and I'm going to introduce Rebecca Vandevoort, and she'll introduce the panel.
So I'm Rebecca Vandevoort, Assistant Vice President at Academic Outreach and Innovation. And AOI is collaborating with the Provost's Office to help facilitate this teaching fellowship program. So do I talk about the program and then introduce the fellows? Okay. So I have been trying to facilitate conversations around teaching on the WSU campus for several years now. And one of the things I often hear is that nobody really cares about teaching. It's not on our annual reviews. It doesn't really make a difference. And this fellowship program is, to a certain extent, the Provost's Office attempt to try to re-message that or correct those kinds of statements. They do care about good teaching, and they are willing to invest in really promoting the scholarship of teaching and learning, research around good teaching, support faculty who are interested in doing this kind of work, and then an expectation of the program is that those same faculty become evangelists for good teaching on the WSU campus. So not only are we funding their ability to do research in their own courses, but the expectation is that they then begin to collaborate with others in their department, across disciplines, and across campuses. And all 4 of the fellows that have been working on this program this year, and this is our first class of fellows, have plans for how they can branch this out and connect with other people. And so I think it's an exciting start to a program that does have long-term commitment. So the call is open right now for new fellows to apply or potential fellows to apply. So I will introduce our fellows, and there is a website and there is a handout that explain all about the Teaching Fellowship Program, and that is available through the Provost's Office website. So we have here today Dr. Erica Offerdahl from Vet Med, Dr. Clif Stratton from History. He's representing the Roots faculty, so Clif is not really in this on his own. He has a team all behind him. You just can't see them. Small team. Dr. Jeff Sanders, also from History. And in Vancouver, Dr. Gretchen Rollwagen-Bollens. I always have to say that slowly. It's a tongue twister. So I'm going to let each of them spend some time describing their research and what they are being funded to do and how that's going so far. None of the work is complete yet, and we do understand that. And then we have some questions, and they'll each go through and answer those questions. So do we have a particular order? Erica Offerdahl.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to try and be brief, but I really am excited about our project. So I'll try not to ramble on. The project that I'm working on is actually within the context of a much larger research question that my lab is posing. And it stems from national reform documents within biology education. So I'm in Vet Med, I'm in the School of Molecular Biosciences, and I collaborate with one of the lead instructors for Biology 107, which is the second semester of the intro biosequence. And our national reform documents instruct us and guide us in terms of what transformative undergraduate science education should look like. And the calls there help us understand that we should be focusing on providing authentic experiences for our undergraduates, both in their lab courses and in their lecture courses. And so Dr. Davis has worked over the past several years to renovate, that's sort of a weird word, but revise, update the lab sequence. And he's been able to demonstrate that by integrating course-based undergraduate research into the large lecture lab component, that he's able to positively affect student learning and, importantly, to reduce DFW rates. But we're unsatisfied with the progress that's happened. Namely, we see that there's a subset of students for which we're still seeing a large achievement gap. And so we've moved on to see what we can do in the large lecture component. Dr. Davis has already implemented active learning strategies that align with evidence-based instruction. And so we're really trying to set the stage for something that's a little, I feel, very innovative, and that would be to move almost completely away from lecture and to approach teaching biology content through argumentation. And so you might wonder why we're choosing scientific argumentation, and that's because scientists argue every day. Every time we look at a piece of data and we try and compel our colleagues to understand why this helps explain a biological phenomenon, every lab, every seminar, every paper we write is a form of argumentation. So it's a critical component for scientists and also for our citizens. So you can imagine for non-science majors and even for our undergraduate students outside of the life sciences, argumentation, making evidence-based claims is really important. There's been a lot of research that looks at how to do scientific argumentation as a product, but we're seeing it as a vehicle for learning. And the reason we see that it's a vehicle for learning is because it helps students think about the content in a really deep way. So before we can take that big step in terms of doing scientific argumentation in the large lecture environment, we need to have a way to prepare students for argumentation, because we're going to be abandoning a lot of the lecture, and we might be concerned that students aren't getting the nuts and bolts that they need. So we've been investigating pre-class activities and their efficacy in terms of preparing students for in-class argumentation, so that they're acquiring the content that they need and they can leverage that content in the environment. In the large lecture environment. So that means that they have to have some minimum level of content understanding, and they have to be able to transfer and apply that. So if we dig into the cognitive science literature, we can learn something about the types of activities that might engender that deep initial learning for students. You're right, it is weird not seeing your slides, isn't it? So we can go to the next piece. So we understand from the cognitive science literature, there's pretty much general agreement that when students are learning something outside of class and trying to apply it in a novel context in an active learning environment, that the difficulties that students have in transferring is likely due to something that we're calling a failure to transfer. And what that means is that students really aren't learning things at a deep level to begin with. And so we're trying to design tasks that will increase students' initial learning and make it very deep so that they have something that they could transfer in for scientific argumentation. So this is all within the context of biology, but I think you could really insert any discipline, because as scholars, we're all using evidence in a disciplinary specific way to make arguments and claims. So I'll go quickly through the next slide. I hope it's not animated. But this comes out of the work by Mickey Chi. She's a cognitive psychologist at Arizona State University. And they've leveraged the literature to generate a hypothesis about the sorts of activities that engender deep learning. And from left to right, the ones on the left are the activities that most engender deep learning, and the ones on the right are the ones that result in more superficial learning. And so if we're thinking about this in the context of what we have our students do before they come to class, asking students to watch a lecture passively is least likely to engender deep learning, or at least acquisition of knowledge that they can then transfer into the lecture. The next best thing is an active approach, and commonly what we see faculty do here is they do a reading quiz. So we're asking our students to rehearse and retrieve information, and there's certainly some evidence from the learning sciences that tells us that students are able to bring those factoids in, but in terms of really leveraging them in a connected and meaningful way, even the reading quizzes aren't as effective. So the next would be categorization tasks. This is where students are given multiple examples of a phenomenon, and they are asked to sort those different examples, and I'll explain here in a minute why that engenders deep initial learning. And then, of course, all the way to the left is the argumentation task. That's what we'd be having them do in class. So categorization tasks, the reason they work is because for each, like in our case, it's a biological scenario, and the students get 6 cards that they're asked to sort. And those cards have surface features. Those are the things that you can literally read off the slide or off the card. So for here, next slide, sorry. So for here I have, for example, superhero cards. I borrowed these from Kimberly Tanner, a colleague of mine. And a surface feature here would be capes. You can see that there are capes. You can see that there are animal-like features on Wolverine. So those are all literal things that I can see on the slide. Next slide. But then students have to identify what are the relevant surface features versus the irrelevant surface features and derive a relationship there. So I might look at the capes of the 2 relevant surface features of cape, and I might extract from that those are that capes equal flying. Okay, so that's a relationship that I would derive, or I'd be able to synthesize on my own. Next slide. And then it's the interaction between those what are called first order interactions that students then that supports deep learning. So a student might look at the first order interaction of capes equals flying, and bats and wolverines are animals, so those are all sorts of mammal-y things. And so they might then use that information to say, well, I'm going to sort these according to, I'm going to sort these cards into 2 groups, those that fly or that can do a functionality, and those that that can evolve like an animal. I don't know, I'm making this up on the fly. But there are other things that students should be attending to here. So for those of you who are comic book geeks like my husband, you might be able to sort these according to Justice League, I think, and
Is that a thing?
Marvel versus DC. Thank you, Dr. Mixter. So the idea is that as you're looking across these different scenarios, it supports students in identifying relevant surface features, those first-order relationships, and all that. So I think I have like one more slide, maybe, yeah, just fast forward to the graph. So, oh yeah, that's weird. Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, let's go here. Yeah, so the last semester we wanted to test the hypothesis, like which one is going to be better at preparing our students for argumentation. So we gave some of the students a reading quiz and some of them a categorization task, and then they completed an assessment before they came to class that measured their incoming knowledge that they would have acquired from these 2 things, and we found that there was no difference. So that made me sad, because all this theory said that it should work, and it didn't. But we realized that we made a really crappy categorization task. We actually didn't follow the design principles that we should have. So we reran the experiment, and this time we just wanted to see if we'd made a good categorization task. And by good, I mean, did it have the appropriate first-order features, the appropriate second-order features? Could students identify them? And could they arrive at a correct sort? And so the next slide here is, okay, so I gotta unpack this a little bit. So overall, 60% of our students were able to sort them correctly, which is, you might be thinking, that's not even a C average, right? It's not even 70%. But I think this is really good, because for these intro bio students, they weren't provided any additional support. They were used to reading quizzes, not sorting tasks. It was near the end of the semester, and so what we were asking them to do for just 5 participation points was actually a lot. So the fact that we had students doing it, taking it seriously, and getting 60%, we felt pretty good about. But what we wanted to see was, of those 60% that got it right, were they getting it right for the right reasons? Meaning, did they notice that it was supposed to be DC versus Marvel versus capes and animals? That wasn't the sort test. We didn't have them do superheroes. We had them do biological stuff. And so what we see here is that by and large, those students that sorted the cards that they're supposed to be sorting as intended, they attended to the correct things. So this is not a false positive, this is an actual positive. And then if you advance for me. And for the students that sorted incorrectly, arrived at an unintended sort, they were noticing inappropriate relevant surface features. They were drawing on inappropriate first order references. So if you go back to the superhero example, they were paying attention to cape equals fly, not a deeper feature that I don't understand because I'm not a comic book person. So again, this means that we're not getting a false negative either. So when students are getting it wrong, it's really because they don't understand the relationships there, not just because they misunderstood the task. So we're feeling pretty good now at this stage in the game where we know how to craft a categorization task, that we can administer it appropriately in the large lecture hall. There were actually some logistical hiccups that we hadn't even realized were going to pop up. We were administering it via Blackboard, for example, and students, we always assume, I have always assumed that students go on to Blackboard and they go to the main page, and then if they're going to access a quiz, they go through content and then the date and then click on the quiz. And these students didn't. They just go to the alert and they bypass the website, and that became a problem for how they were accessing the sort task. So it's interesting, I mean, to bring it back to the whole teaching fellow program, the research that I'm doing has certainly not progressed as quickly as I had wanted it to, but I think what we're learning is so much more meaningful, and I can see applications outside of intro bio and not just within the sciences, but I can see that, you know, being able to communicate to other faculty how you might use a sorting task or a categorization task in your own teaching environment is useful. And I can talk to you about the ways not to do it, and I could talk to you about the ways to do it. So it's been a really exciting time. But this semester now, we're at this stage where we can actually test the sorting tasks and do a first go at argumentation in the classroom. So we're feeling kind of excited about it. I probably talked too long, but so I'll pass it on. So Gretchen.
All right. Well, yeah, I have a title slide here. So I'm here on the Vancouver campus. I'm a associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences and the School of the Environment. And this wasn't intended or planned, but Erica has been focusing the work they're doing on this particular project on Biology 107. And I have been focused on Biology 106, which is actually the first semester, or they can take it out of sequence, but anyway, it's the generally taken in the fall of the introductory biology sequence. And I teach on the Vancouver campus, and so I've really been interested for a number of years in being able to use the Biology 106 course. This is, you know, these students, I think, Erica, are one of the 107 students in Pullman, are they primarily, do more take it in the spring than take it in the fall?
No, we get kind of equal across fall and spring.
Equal, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here in Vancouver, we don't have as many students and we don't have as many faculty, so we teach Biology 106 in the fall and we teach Biology 107 in the spring. And we have about 175 to 200 students in the 106 course. And so at least, most of the students that take this course are true freshmen. They're often, this is their first semester on campus. But we have a large transfer population here in Vancouver, and we have, probably relative to Pullman anyway, a fairly high concentration of non-traditional students who are older, and that definition we define here as greater than 25 years old. A lot of first-generation college students, you know, a sort of a mixture of veterans, people with some disabilities, things like that. So I've been really interested in how can a course such as this, that is often the first one that the student will take in the sciences when they come to university, even if they've been at community college prior to this. And indeed, we've looked a lot at our retention rates of especially diverse students or non-traditional students in bachelor's degrees in science. And how can we both improve our recruitment but also improve our retention to graduation of all kinds of students, but especially ones who maybe historically haven't been as successful in attaining that bachelor's degree. So as part of my project, what I proposed for the teaching fellowship was to have some resources to be able to devote a little bit more of my time towards creating a laboratory experience in the Biology 106 course that would have local relevance, that they could work on projects that were authentic. They weren't necessarily ones where we already know the answers, and so we can kind of determine whether or not they're doing things correctly, but give students an opportunity to work on a project that might be one they have a personal investment in or that is relevant to their community or to their lives in some way, as a way of pulling them in and engaging them early in their experience as a science major in this is what science actually is, this is how scientists conduct their work. It isn't all sort of predictable. So you see my goal there was to infuse these authentic experiences into a lower division science class. But I wanted to do this in a way where I could actually assess whether or not this approach was having the desired outcomes. And indeed, in 107, I guess they're doing something similar. It's one of the little quirks about the multiple campuses is even though these courses are taught, the same courses are taught on our multiple campuses, we have different facilities to allow for something. So the irony is that in Biology 106, since the course here is only about 175 to 200 students, in Pullman, the Biology 106 class is more like 600 on average per semester. And so some of the things that I've been doing for years in the lab in 106 have not necessarily been transferable to the Pullman campus just because of the sheer number of students and the fact that it's team taught and so forth. The alternate is true in 107 since Dr. Davis has worked so hard to build these research experience into the Biology 107 lab. The facilities needed to do those labs we don't have in Vancouver. So one of the goals is, and I think on the next slide, advance forward. So I wanted to incorporate this research experience. And then I'll show on the next one that I also really want to think about how can we use our different resources across the system to be able to test ideas and then share them, sort of vertically between lower division and upper division courses, but also horizontally in our system, that if we're finding that the 100 level course in one campus works, for that population and that place, what changes do we make or do we need to make so that we can take some of those benefits and apply them in a different campus setting. So that's one of the goals I have based on what we learn. So actually, if you go back one, thanks. So I want to incorporate this course-based undergraduate research experience that Erica also referred to. The acronym is CURE. And there's growing literature on what the best practices are around implementing cures, how to assess them, or ways that people have assessed them. And so the resources from the teaching fellowship have allowed me to establish a collaboration with an investigator at Portland State who is a biology education researcher, and have developed an assessment program so that we can see and measure what kinds of impacts this experience is having. And there are, to sort of qualify as a course-based undergraduate research experience, there were a number of characteristics in the project that we wanted to ensure, and I'll talk about those in a moment. So you can move on to the next one. And so even though I have been, for the last 3 or 4 years, I've actually had this research experience in the Biology 106 lab, but this year, in fall of 2017, was able to implement this assessment and to kind of fine-tune a little bit the projects so that we were meeting more of those criteria to be a cure. So if you go to the next bullet, you can go all through those bullets. Essentially, I want to be able to have some data that I can use to make changes to the way that I'm implementing this experience in Biology 106, but then also be able to spend time with other faculty, both in biology and other disciplines here on the Vancouver campus, and then similarly talk to colleagues in the School of Biological Sciences, or indeed across life sciences at other campuses. And I think there's probably some very interesting things that we could pursue here that might merit a proposal to the National Science Foundation's Innovations in Undergraduate Science Education program. All right, next slide. So what we did, I'll just briefly say that the cure that I focused on was one of the things that makes these cures gives that some sustainability is when the instructor chooses a kind of a range of project ideas that are aligned with their own research, and that there's and I think some of the responses I've gotten from students confirm this, that that helps contribute to the not just the idea, but the reality that what students are working on actually is going to have some legs beyond just the classroom laboratory, that they're contributing to research that is ongoing and that may ultimately be published in some way, or goes beyond just the sort of the course needs. So one area of my research is in the role of aquatic invasive species in food webs, or sort of trophic impacts. And there's an invasive clam, the Asian clam, that is present throughout the Columbia River. In fact, it's all over North America, but it was introduced in the Columbia River first in North America, and now it's all over the place. And of course, our campus is right on the river, and so I have a couple of graduate students that have been looking at the role of these clams, and so I realized, looking at their feeding, it's a pretty straightforward kind of experimental approach. And but there's a lot of things that we can learn that we don't have the capacity to do just in our lab. So got the idea, well, maybe we should get the students going on this, and they could think of what kinds of environmental factors might influence the rates of consumption of prey by these bivalves. And they're easy to use, and of course in the summer or the early summer before I planned to do this, the first time, there were tons and tons of clams that I could just go down and spend 20 minutes at the beach and just get buckets of clams. And then I implemented this last fall, and they were all gone. And so I had to travel up a little further to find them, so that put a little just logistical issue on things. So anyway, they brought them back. They set up these experiments where they could measure what food they were consuming, and so there was some setup they needed to do, and I allowed them in groups of 4 to come up with their own hypotheses within I gave them kind of a big container to be in, and within that they could look at the effect of temperature, they could look at the effect of food source, or salinity, or there were the big wildfires here last fall in Eagle Creek, and there was ash falling all over the place at the time that we started running these experiments and collecting the clams. And so they were really interested in what the ash fall might have for these organisms, since they were literally under this rain of ash. And so then we had them, they had to be able to iterate, so they did a preliminary set of experiments, and then they ran secondary experiments. We shared the data amongst them all, they helped compile it. And then even though they worked in groups, each individual student wrote and submitted a lab report, but written in a manuscript style. And we gave feedback on multiple drafts of that over the semester. So the project went for about 10 weeks, sometimes in the background, sometimes as their primary activity in the lab. And I just put one figure in here showing that a number of groups were really interested in the effect of temperature, and we see that the grazing rates actually seem to be highest at this medium temperature of 22 degrees, and lower or higher depending on whether it was warmer or colder, and that students were starting to think about what impacts potential climate change may have, and so forth. So the average course grade for the fall was pretty good. It was actually like 80.1, which made me very happy because I didn't really change anything else in the class other than putting this lab experience in. If you go to the next slide. So we did a pre and a post survey. So prior to the beginning, before we started the actual lab experiments, they took an online survey that were trying to assess their attitudes about science and a little bit about their scientific literacy, especially around research and research design. And then we gave them those same surveys at the end of the semester. And I had pretty good responses. I haven't been able to analyze those data yet because I just got them in January, but I'm looking forward to seeing that. But I did put some questions into the blue evaluation to ask them what they thought about the experience and whether they thought it was worthwhile and what they, just a few things. And I was really pleased to see that the vast majority of students recommended that I continue including some kind of cure. Some of them didn't really like clams that much, so I have to think about that part. But and I was also pleased to see that about half of the respondents, and this was about 67% of the class, said that they now want to pursue a career that involves research after participating in this. And there are a couple of quotes there from students from their blue evaluation that I thought was it was quite heartening. So it's not perfect by any means, and I'm eager to look at these results to know how we could improve it, and then start thinking about what are the elements of this, the way that we did things in 106 that could be transferable to other classroom settings, but especially in the lower division to try and kind of get away from this notion that you've got to get through all the early stuff before you get to the good stuff in science, and that the good stuff can come right up front. So I think that's all I have. I can't remember if I have a slide after that. Nope.
All right. Hi, I'm Jeff Sanders. I'm in the history department. I teach environmental history and Pacific Northwest history. And so I'm kind of a place-based historian. And one of the things I've been playing around with for the last couple of years is trying to get students to do really high-quality research projects on this place. And one of the things I've noticed as I've been doing a lot of research and teaching is that there is kind of a proliferation of digital projects out there, digital history, digital collections, different kinds of historical collections that are now much more available to students. But what I've also noticed is there isn't a lot of engagement, especially from, I don't know, some portion of my faculty, and even in my own case, of actually using those kinds of digital sources. So I thought one of the things I'd like to start doing is engaging students in doing research with those kinds of digital sources, but also thinking about how they use digital sources. And so my project is grounding digital history, because I'm an environmental historian. And so I've been thinking about how to especially incorporate place-based research using sources that we have available here at the university and at MASC, which is our university archive. And so I should go to the goals. My basic goals here, and they're sort of, like I say, humble goals, sarcastically, because they're gigantic goals: to transform digital teaching and research and history, which is, I don't know how far I'm going to get with that or what the metric is for that, but we'll see. I want to create new models of engagement and original research, and I think engagement is probably the place where I'm going to have the most success, is get it sort of pushing my fellow faculty and myself in the direction of digital history and digital humanities. And then finally, really institutionalizing digital approaches in my department and beyond. So creating models for people across the university, especially across my department at different campuses. So far, and this, by the way, this, if we can go back for a second, this slide here is not something I produced. This is the Stanford University Spatial History Project, which is kind of a model of this kind of work that I would like to at least model some of the things that we do here on. This is one of their projects, which was a guy tracking post offices in the early West, the opening of post offices and then the closure of many of these post offices, in order to look at the way that mail, capital, et cetera, flowed through different parts of the West. And I'm putting this up here partly because the project that I'm starting to plan with some colleagues that would give sort of a long-term element to my project would be doing something kind of like this with different data about the Palouse. So I'll talk more about that in a second. So far, the main work that I've been doing is in transforming and institutionalizing is developing curriculum. Because I think without having people teaching courses, without the expectation that we're going to engage with digital sources, digital tools, and make use of the incredible support that we now have on this campus through the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation, which is just sort of, they want people to come over there and use the tools and learn about the different tools that they've got going on there. And they support a variety of teaching and different kinds of experiences that I think I'd like to plug more and more of our students into. So the first thing I've been doing is developing this course that's finished now, which is a digital place history for undergraduates. And the idea is to start them down the road of thinking about how do I think about historical research as data, for instance, looking at census data, and manipulating it in different ways, maybe visualizing it in new ways that inform their research and changes the way they see basic questions. So going beyond just kind of the text-based research that we often do and getting them to think about their data in new ways and collecting data in new ways that is possible now because of some of the digital tools available. So that's the first thing. The other part of this, and maybe the main metric of my project, is going to be how much of this I'm able to actually accomplish, how much I'm able to convince my colleagues to do. So I'm also creating a graduate course, which is going to have to go through many hoops and to be supported. But the idea would be to start teaching graduate students a bit about the theory and practice of digital methods and learning tools that they can use in their own research, but then also tools that they can use to present their research. Increasingly, this is an area of growth in history, both in research and also just being able to present your research. Digital tools are really critical to that process. And then how we can start to help graduate students think about teaching with history graduate students, teaching with these tools. So everything from just sort of the mundane Blackboard experience, getting people to understand how to optimize that, but also other kinds of tools that Clif is using, for instance, in RCI, to collaborate in new ways online, but also outside the classroom and inside the classroom. So there's kind of a gap in, I think, graduate education, around, at least in history, around thinking digitally and acting digitally. So that's something I'm almost finished with that development of that course. Then, as far as building relationships across campus, and across the campuses, and also I've been collaborating with my doppelganger over at the University of Idaho, who's also an environmental historian. We've co-taught classes before in digital, where we use more digital tools, and sort of I've spent quite a bit of time developing these kinds of relationships on this campus and then between the campuses during this year. And one of the main connections that we're going to develop is with the Hanford History Project, which is down at the Tri-Cities campus, trying to figure out how to work with that project and maybe get more graduate students engaging with work that is not necessarily, that is sort of alternative career possibilities. Because, of course, the PhD market, or the market for PhDs is shrinking drastically. And so the idea is to create more diversity in the kinds of skills that people coming out of our program have. And so one way to do that is to create the possibility of internships, but also learning these kinds of these new tools. So as far as building relationships, I'm doing that across the campuses. And then possible models is the other issue. I'm trying to create right now with another colleague in the history department, and a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is basically building capacity, I guess is the way I would describe it, is to create two projects. One is the Columbia Plateau Digital History Project, which is a proposed project to take place-based approaches and integrate them into the different classes that I've already proposed, but then to have a project that's sort of an ongoing project that students can contribute to and participate in, so they get real-world sort of experience doing digital history. And then the other project is, I'm on the Historic Preservation Committee, and one of the things we're doing in that committee is compiling information about each one of the buildings on campus, and we want to have a digital archive of that kind of material that everybody on campus can access, planners, when they get ready to consider sacrificing a building on this campus, they'll have a historical record that they can go through and think about. But having that compiled by students over time and give them the experience of doing those kinds of projects is one of the other elements of sort of building capacity. And then, of course, in the long run, for those two projects, I'm hoping to get some kind of outside funding to do more of that and to build sort of permanence to this approach to history, and we'll see how it goes. So that's my project.
All right. I'm Clif Stratton, and I need to start by saying that I have a colleague, Katy Fry, in the history department, who's actually part of this fellowship in equal ways that I am. So, but I agreed to be the kind of lead in terms of meetings and those kinds of things to protect her time. So a little bit about the program that I teach in. We'll provide some context for what we're doing. I'm the assistant director for the Roots of Contemporary Issues program, which is essentially, to students anyway, and to advisors, is History 105 and 305. And that's a course that I think about 95%, probably more, students take at WSU, ideally in their first year, whether they're a transfer student or a four-year student. And our program began when UCOR began in 2012. And one of the things that we are tasked with and have taken on since the beginning is providing a foundational first-year experience for the kinds of skills that students will need as they progress through the university and into careers or onto graduate school. So of the 5 UCOR learning goals or of the 7 UCOR learning goals that students engage with, we cover 5 of them in a kind of introductory way in History 105 and 305. We also, early on in 2013, developed an assessment program within our program to measure how students are doing on those various skills. And that's grown into something that we now have like a 10-year assessment program. And yeah, it's become complex. But one of the things that we do with our assessment is to identify skills that students are relatively weak on relative to other skills that they're practicing in the class, and to make some substantive changes on the ground in the classroom to help students improve those skills. We have the benefit of we have a relatively large faculty, I suppose. We have about, if you include all the campuses, I think 14 faculty that whose primary job is to teach this class in fall and spring. So, but that, despite the size and the number of students we teach, we're actually kind of a relatively well-oiled machine. We meet regularly. We talk about our assessment. Everyone participates in the assessment. So we can make changes or adapt our teaching across classes that has a wide impact because we're teaching so many students and have so many sections every semester. One of the skills that students have consistently performed lower on throughout the life of our program is source analysis. We find that in terms of where we think students ought to be at an introductory level, they do pretty well with critical thinking. They can demonstrate the ability to locate appropriate sources, communicate in written form, these kinds of things. But consistently, source analysis has been a relatively, students have been weaker on that. It's unsurprising. It's a harder skill. But we've been trying to make some concerted efforts to improve their ability to do that kind of work. In particular, what we find, just a brief rundown, and you can correct me if maybe this is confusing, but a primary source in history is the raw evidence produced by historical actors, and of course secondary sources are the historians like Jeff and I. And in particular, we want students to be able to really grapple with those primary sources, but as a secondary goal, being able to kind of pick apart a secondary source, identify an argument, make an argument, those kinds of things are important too. So if we could, you're already there, great. Okay, the goals, the primary goal of the fellowship that Katie and I proposed was to assess our efforts to have students collaborate in class on these skills. The question we want to know is, does that, over time, over the course of a semester, have a measurable impact on their ability to then do that in their own writing, to use sources and analyze them in critical ways in their own writing? The other component of this that we're interested in understanding is the role of these new active learning classrooms that we now have in the Spark. For those of you in Pullman, you probably know this, and maybe you've heard about it in Vancouver, but it's some mystery. It's a classroom building, but some of the rooms are sort of set up in pods, and there's a computer there for students to use, and so you can actually have them do this kind of collaboration digitally. And so I teach in one of those rooms this semester, and Katie, my colleague, teaches in one of these flex rooms. So her technological ability to have students do these kinds of collaborations are more limited, right, than mine. So we wanted to kind of see whether or not that particular kind of setting had any impact on student success on source analysis. So the other thing that we wanted to build into the fellowship plan was to make sure that we're sort of scaling up these kinds of activities over the course of the semester. So we're now at the end of week 5, and students they've been reading some primary sources, they've been reading secondary sources, we've been discussing them in class, but we've not. I think this week was the first time that Katie did one of her how the groups collaborate and do an annotation, and my first one is planned for next week. And then after that, we're going to start doing them more often and more often, so that by the end of the semester, students are pretty comfortable with it. They're doing it a lot more, so there's a kind of intensity about it that there isn't yet in the semester. And we want to be able, the reason that we did that was so that in their early writing assignments, we could compare their ability to analyze sources to those later assignments, and to see whether or not the frequency with which we do this, their comfort level with it, right? Essentially their ability to build that skill and to practice that skill, we can see that change over time. So in terms of beyond our own classrooms and even beyond our own program, the goal of this experiment was to, I guess it's in part twofold. One is to be able to provide some evidence, however it falls, as to the usefulness of these sort of digital settings and group settings, the kind of physical space of the classroom, whether or not that makes a big enough impact or not. And then also to be able to develop sets of workshops. This is one of the things, and maybe we could go to the work plan. Develop sets of workshops that are applicable outside of the discipline of history for other faculty to adopt something similar in their own classes. So our work plan in the fall was mostly about sort of aligning our courses so that when we began the actual work of the fellowship in the spring, there weren't so many differences in our courses that we wouldn't be able to tell whether or not our interventions on behalf of the fellowship were making a difference. So Katie and I decided that we would have at least four assigned primary sources in common that her students would read and my students would read. And then that we would have an additional number that were different based on the approaches we take in the classroom, but that we would have roughly the same number. We also aligned our writing assignments, so students are the end products where we want to evaluate how they're translating these collaborations, source annotation, collaboration in class to their writing and their analysis and their writing. So that was fall. In the spring, what we've designed are a kind of annotation series for these primary sources. So Katie and I both have a course reader that we assign. So all the sources are in there that students annotate in addition to other ones that they read. And we asked them to do a kind of hard copy annotation before coming to class, work through some questions, develop a style, an individual style for annotating that works for them. And then in class, they spend time in teams of 5 collaborating on a digital annotation, so sort of taking what they've already done, discussing it, deciding what to cut, what to add, what to modify, and we provide them a digital copy of the document. None of them are longer than 2 to 4 pages usually of text, and they spend time using an Adobe annotation tool, pretty simple tool at this point. We wanted to start with something that was relatively technologically simple, that we wouldn't have to spend a ton of time sort of getting them used to the tool itself. And then they'll turn that in and to Blackboard at the end of class, and what Katie and I will then be able to do is to look at individual groups of students, because they submitted as a group. We can actually compare how those individual students did on their group annotation. Was it a kind of full annotation of the source? How well did they identify certain concepts? And then we can actually go look at those students' source analysis in their individual writing that they turn in later, and to see whether or not there's an impact there. So a lot of that assessment work, some of that assessment work on the written, the source analysis and the written work will actually get done in the course of grading their assignments. So we've developed a rubric that we're both using that can allow us to get some a sort of baseline there. But in the summer, we really want to dig into these things, both the annotations themselves that students do in groups, but also look more closely at a sample of writing to identify how well this process and these activities improve their skills. So that's going to take the form of, at the very least, a report, and have plans to publish this as well. And then one of the things that Katie will be working on during the summer is to develop a series of workshops that can be transferred to other disciplines, other faculty. So you can see an example of, like, this is just my annotations from the course guide, but this is an example of what they might bring to class And then if you can sort of imagine something like this in digital form, they could produce something collaboratively like that. So those are just my notes. But so that's where we are.
Great. Thank you all for those presentations. And so following the great LIF panel that I saw a couple of weeks ago, we have put together some questions, and we'll just go through them for as long as until 5 o'clock when we run out of time. And you can all answer, or one of you answer, or not. So I'm curious, when you saw the teaching fellowship applications last year, was this research that you were already working on? Had you been doing research on your own teaching in the past? Was this research that you were just conceptualizing and able to enter into because of the fellowship?
Just conceptualizing. So this allowed a new research question to begin.
Great, thanks.
For me, this was something I wanted to do, but I'll admit the resources and the funds were helpful to, it's going to support a graduate student to help, and it's going to support, buying materials to do the research projects, and it also supporting the time to analyze the assessment results, and that was, I don't think I could have done it without that. Now it is becoming more of a research area, and I think I might have some good preliminary data to get additional support. But this got me to say, okay, yes, I can take time away from other things because I have the resources I can devote towards this.
Perfect, thanks.
So, yeah, I've been dabbling in digital humanities for a while, and just sort of sneaking in some different, I guess, platforms and tools into my teaching. So, for instance, I used Omeka, which is a platform for, I don't know how you describe it.
Providing metadata?
Providing metadata is part of it, and metadata is like part of this is a learning experience for me. And I think what's happening so these are things I've been doing for a while, but this is kind of formalizing and, like I said, institutionalizing, I hope, things that I've been doing off and on for the last 3 years in my courses. So less about the kind of research that I've been doing, but the way that I would like to have my students either using digital tools or presenting in new ways in my courses. And that's kind of the long-term goal. But this has allowed me sort of the space and the time and the support to formalize it.
Great.
For me, as I mentioned, the question grew out of our annual assessment, and the source analysis has been lower relative to the other skills for several years. And at first, I think those of us in leadership in the program and faculty in general, we said, well, that makes sense. It's hard, right? But it's also an important skill that we want students to become better at more quickly earlier on in their careers. So this allowed Katie and I to sort of lead an experiment that we can then bring back first to our faculty in the Roots program, but then beyond, and really sort of say whether or not a sort of concerted effort at getting students to practice this, can really pay off. I don't suspect it's a waste of time, but it's certainly it really does transform the kind of time you devote within any given class or a semester to to lecture, to other kinds of activities, because this will consume some class time that we might spend otherwise, and so we want to know if that's a beneficial use of time as well. So.
Great, and I have a question I didn't send, so this is going to take you by surprise, but I just kind of thought about it from a conversation I was involved in last night as well. So it's annual review time, and I don't believe any of you are full professors, Correct. So are any of you concerned that this research is not going to reflect as robustly on your annual review as some other kind of research in your discipline?
Well, I'll take a stab at that because this is an area that I'm actually really interested in pursuing, expanding my research program to incorporate. I mean, I'm not going to become a education researcher. That's not going to be my primary goal. I'm not in a department that would be in a position to assess advancement in that area.
Okay.
But scholarship
That's helpful.
around teaching in life sciences, and indeed, my school, the environment colleagues are very interested in this as well. So I think it's something that is going to advance, and it's something that I sort of feel like if I'm able to generate scholarship, and that it's contributes to this area of research, and is a way I can engage my undergrads and graduate students in to some degree as somewhat either connected or ancillary to their disciplinary research, and I know a lot of people are very interested in kind of that straddling between, at least I'm sure this is true in many disciplines, but in sciences, and how we communicate it and how we educate students, and so they really want to have some of that experience, and so I think it's going to be, I'll find out when I do or do not get tenure, but I think it's a plus.
Good, okay. Anything else to add to that?
Well, I mean, for me, I put this more in the teaching realm, and that's certainly part of my job and how I'm evaluated. I think there's an element of what I'm interested in doing with students and grad students and with my own work, digitally speaking, that is sort of a bit more like public history, and there's been a long sort of struggle within history departments about what is public history. Is that really the same as publishing a book, for instance, or an article? And in our department, we've worked that out, I think, for the most part, although there's still some debate about it. But in general, that's the direction I think that the field is going. And so, to figure out ways of connecting more with more diverse audiences, to get our messages out there, our work out there. So, but at this point, it's still more in the teaching realm for me.
Okay.
For me, it's it's kind of in the teaching and the service realm for me, because I teach this class, so these kinds of interventions can help me become a better teacher and or affirm that what I'm doing is valuable in some way I can measure it. But also as an assistant director of the RCI program, and one of the things I'm responsible for thinking about are student development of skills across our program. So this allows myself and Katie, who also has an administrative role in the program, to spend time thinking about that, like how best we can promote advancement in these skills at the first year level. So that's in that way it benefits me. I got some other stuff I write, so right?
So Gretchen's tenure track, and Erica, are you tenure track?
Yeah, I'm an associate professor.
Okay, and are you two clinical your tenure track?
Jeff's an associate tenured professor, and I'm clinical.
Okay, so just one clinical.
Professor.
Okay. All right, I should know that, but I don't really remember.
But it's a good mix. I mean,
Right, yeah.
and I think, I don't want to speak for Gretchen, but I think that if this leads to NSF funding, which I think it will, Gretchen, and I...
We got some things to talk about.
Yeah, we should talk. And I similarly, actually, these preliminary data I used in a proposal to NSF this autumn. So, I mean, from that perspective, it sort of fills two niches, right? I do see that it could fit in, at least in the CVM, it fits into teaching because our teaching component explicitly says that scholarship of teaching and learning is part of that. But if I can secure a research grant, then it shifts. So I think that it's double dipping a little bit, maybe.
Right, and we talked about this the last time we all met, that Gretchen and Jeff are really double dipping, and what they're getting is their students to do their research with them.
Mm-hmm.
So giving the students the research exposure and experience, but also benefiting your research. So, okay.
You know, I should note actually that I only started in the tenure track this last fall. That I actually I was a clinical professor. I've been at WSU for quite some time in the clinical track, and sort of leading up to this stage in the project that I was doing was really only, I'm not sure I would have been able to institute this if I was in the first or even second year as an assistant professor, which is sort of technically where I am relative to my tenure decision. So I think it does matter a little bit that I'm not sure that it would be something I could pursue unless I had previous experience doing this if I was a fairly new tenure track faculty member. Clinical, okay. Absolutely. There'd be no question.
Okay. And a couple of you talked about this some, but one of the important goals of the Teaching Fellowship is to promote evidence-based teaching across the university. So what are your plans? How will your research positively impact WSU more broadly beyond just your course or department?
Well, for us, I mean, all of our students, they all take this class, so it's a high impact class, and you teach a high impact class too in that regard too. So just the sheer numbers, if we can sort of shift students, enhance their ability to engage in these kinds of inquiries in whatever discipline they are, you were talking about building capacity. It's sort of building capacity among the undergraduate population. So, is that a trickle-up effect? Is that what that is?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and you talked about Katie doing workshops for faculty.
Yeah, in a practical sense, that those would be the kind of activities we might do, but in a kind of I don't know what the word is.
But
we're
yes,
sending our
certainly.
Students out into these other classes, and they're going to be better equipped to engage in similar kinds of things in other settings, right?
Biology 106, 107, History 105 are all pretty high impact classes.
Well, and what we see at other institutions that this sort of scholarly activity happens in is that students enjoy it, and they start voting with their feet. They'd rather be in an experience where it's more authentic and it's interesting. I mean, you saw the quotes that Gretchen has from her students. So when then they follow up with a subsequent course that's less so that I think that change happens slowly that way through students voicing that they do want this sort of educational experience, that they like to be challenged and they don't want to be spoon-fed. And so I think you're right, it has that potential effect. But I think they also really appreciate the fact that we're serious about doing this, and interested in their input, and we don't want to just try something and assume it's good without any evidence for it. And so I think it's modeling also the whole mission of the research university, which is, we don't make claims unless we have evidence for them, and whatever the norms are in the disciplines about what evidence consists of. But I think, I definitely heard from students anecdotally that they appreciated the fact that I was asking them in the first place, and I was being very upfront and transparent about the fact that, I've been doing this kind of project for a while, but I really need to know if this is worth doing, is it's going to benefit you. And so I think I got a lot of participation among students. I will admit there was a little extra credit associated with filling out some surveys, but I didn't seem to have trouble getting people to respond and to contribute to that, because I think they felt it was going to benefit them. And the other thing I would mention is that for the teaching fellowship more broadly, and I think to the extent that whether it's supported by grand challenge ideas, but if it's seeding
the notion for the university as a whole to support the kind of collaboration across campuses and between units that allow for us to share. You know, I wouldn't have known what Clif and Jeff were doing, probably, but I love the fact that all of the History 105, 305 instructors meet regularly across all the campuses, and I'm familiar with that because I know the history faculty here. And I think the more that that the university can put a little, basically money behind its ideals and say, you know, provide some space and time for faculty to do that in other, you know, whether it's a course that's taught on multiple campuses or it's vertical curriculum planning within a unit, but that, you know, some courses are offered some places and some not, and so I'll use the resources from the fellowship to travel to Pullman, to go to Tri-Cities, to, you know, maybe pay for some lunch or something like that with my colleagues here, anyway, so I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, so I think that really segues to the next question. I mean, how do we get more faculty engaged in either hearing about what you're doing or sharing what they're doing? Because there are lots of good, positive things happening around teaching and learning at WSU, and there are not a lot of faculty in this room right now. So how do we really engage them in this conversation?
I want to be advanced to full professor, so I don't really want to say what I'm thinking. But I think sometimes developing a culture just comes from a very small amount of resources, right? So I am very much like I was as a graduate student. If there's free food, I will be there. But when I'm there, if I have something to talk about and learn about from my colleagues, that was icing on the cake. And so I often, I'm relatively new to Washington State, and we have teaching academies here, and there's sharing in that regard, but there's not a mechanism. But that's at least the CVM Teaching Academy. We see the same folks in that college, and don't branch out to the rest of the campus. And I really wonder about the role of a monthly pedagogical luncheon that is sponsored by a more central unit that you register for, you have lunch, but then these sorts of presentations by faculty are there, little short snippets, but then there's time for sitting at a table with other faculty to talk about it. I know that was powerful at my previous institution, and I learned a lot from my colleagues in history and communication and psychology that I never would have had if I hadn't just had that reason to see them once a month. So
I do have to say, we've been doing these faculty-led workshops for, I think, 4 or 5 years. Phil was on the very first panel on active learning. And this year, because of all the budget cuts, we moved away from the lunch and providing a lunch, and attendance has been abysmal. So I have told my boss that we will, in the future, moving forward, we will be buying lunch again, because there needs to be an attraction, a draw. I think that will.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe just a big
Make
sheet
difference.
cake would draw people in.
Yeah, it doesn't. We've never done a lot. It's not been a catered banquet. It's pizza or a Subway. But
well, and also, I think there needs to be an institutional shift in how teaching success or engagement with teaching by faculty is measured. We still rely primarily on student course evaluations.
Right.
And so there's very little incentive for overworked faculty, whether they're research faculty or instructors teaching, a 4-4 load, to do anything beyond making sure that they've got decent course evaluations. So participation in this kind of thing, right? Obviously there's resources here, so there's a built-in incentive. But in terms of people then coming to hear what LIFT faculty or the fellows here are doing, I think that's got to be built into the sort of long game for advancement
I
for
do think, I am
individuals.
optimistic we'll begin to see that with Kelly Ward now in the provost's office and coming out of the College of Education and being very cognizant about different kinds of artifacts of teaching success. And I know that's something she's talked with me about, and how we begin to spread that out, that it's not just about course evals, and how you at your annual review talk about your teaching and what kind of artifacts you bring to that conversation. So I think there's some positives there. So Katie and Phil, you really are two primary attendees here, unless the media team have questions. But before I ask the last question, do either of you have questions for the teaching fellows? No? No?
There's so many questions, but
Okay.
continue to interact.
So I do sense there has been some sharing and collaboration just between the four of you. That, I mean, obviously you two knew each other,
Sure.
and I'm probably Gretchen, and you didn't know each other at all. And I know we do meet, not every month. We started with every month. That seemed too much. So every couple of months, just to keep each other apprised. And I think there has been some conversation about potentially some collaborative research, or at least Gretchen being able to talk about what Erica's doing with other biology folks, and Erica being able to talk with Gretchen about what Gretchen's doing with other biology folks. So you guys can speak to that, but I've sensed some collaboration.
Yeah, Jeff, one of Jeff's goals is to help train graduate students in how to use these tools and implement them not just in their own research, but in teaching and presenting. And so all of the graduate students in our department TA for History 105 at some point. So there's a kind of natural connection there between what Jeff's doing and the role that graduate students have in our sections of 105. So you asked me to review your draft graduate seminar syllabus, and the way that you can speak about it more, but the way that it's structured, there's a kind of teaching section, right? The whole third of the class, and that would be a place for students, graduate students, to think about, well, how can I implement that when I lead class in 105? Or so you can say more if you want, but
Yeah, I mean, I met with you a couple of times. I met with Katie, and I'll be, curious to see what ends up happening with your project, because you're going to actually do some of these things before I get a chance to do them. You'll have data about, sort of what worked and what didn't work, and maybe in the future can sort of feed, test
Yeah.
tools in your. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about RCI is you've got so many students that you have data, good data. So, but I mean, so for me, it's been collaborating with these fellows, but also, thinking about how to connect my students to, and this goes back to your previous question. I mean, I think that there are these different contexts on our campus where we can come together, and the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation is one of those spaces on our campus. It's not used enough. Also, MASC, the archive, which historians use a lot, and we all send our students there to do research, but there are these certain places where these conversations can happen more easily. I mean, this has been a great experience for our meetings, but creating those contexts or taking advantage of those contexts, I think, are important. But that's sort of the other question.
Sorry, that reminds me of something else too, that, we mentioned that Eric and I didn't know each other before this fall, but coincidentally, we did meet at a conference we both went to in this Partnership for Undergraduate Life Sciences Education group, and that's where I met Bill Davis for the first time also. And I think what I was going to say earlier about how do we engage other faculty in conversations such as this is, being able to take advantage of the fact that there's a pretty large movement right now in life science education. Not that it's new, but I'm sort of new coming into it, that around reform and transforming this undergraduate experience, and so the fact that there's a lot of synergies that I've noticed ever since I got the resources from the teaching fellowship to pursue this, that they're just coming up all over the place. And I think my colleagues here are interested in the ways that this might help advance diverse students through our programs. And think about, okay, so we talk about it because there is this disciplinary focused effort that we are connecting into. And so this resource from WSU means that, okay, I can engage in that a little bit more than just attend a workshop or, read about what else somebody else is doing. So, I mean, I guess I view it as more like a seed grant kind of thing in some ways. And the nice thing is that the resources here are a little better than this, well, at least some of the typical seed grants. So there are a lot of these sort of unexpected synergies that I've really been interested in, and I think are going to mean that more happens here as a result of tapping into something that multiple faculty have interest in, and that's what brings people to workshops, right? Or there's a personal self-interest. I have X amount of time. I can only divide it up so many ways. Food helps, but is it going to advance what I'm doing? Is a really another important one, and I think this program helps with that.
Great. So the last question is there anything about this program that's surprised you one way or the other? People should be prepared for.
I think I'm not surprised exactly, but just listening to the different projects, we're all grappling with the same kinds of issues. How do you get students engaged? How do you work with evidence and critical thinking and interpretation? Everybody's doing that, obviously. And I can learn something from the scientists as much as I can from Clif about doing that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's surprising, but I didn't expect it necessarily.
Agreed.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. And this will be closed captioned, archived, and put up on the website. So as others are curious about the Teaching Fellow program and the works you're doing, it'll be up there and available. Thanks to all of the media team who's always here making this happen, and the instructional designers and Christy who's facilitating it. And we will have our Teaching Innovation Day on February 19th, and all of you are participating in that except for Jeff. We never quite got that happening. So hopefully we'll have some robust attendance at that event. Thank you.